Hello, hello, everybody. It is this afternoon in the East Coast at 1 o'clock on Tuesday, what are we, February 27th, end of February already, 2024. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on wherever you might be watching and whenever you might be watching. For those of you who are joining live, feel free to say hi in the comments. I would love to get a chance to chat with you there. And if you're watching in replay, you can also share a comment. And you can also share any of the questions and ideas that we share here with a friend. So thank you so much for spending some time here with me today. So this weekend, I actually spent time in a room that I almost chose not to be in. So let me explain. So I've been thinking a lot about connection and thinking about how those of us who maybe are in conversation with a lot of people, maybe you are working with a lot of people, but are you really connecting? And I'd made an intentional decision earlier in the year to be able to say, I want to put myself in rooms where I'm not the smartest person in the room, where the conversation, the people in it are going to raise me up and where I can really be myself and also contribute and be useful, but also gain connection, gain community from that. And as I've been talking to a lot of my clients, this issue of connection is sometimes so fleeting, right? We're connected. Obviously, you and I are connected here through this through this screen, but are we really connecting? Are we really able to have really good, rich conversations? Are we able to have that back and forth? And so, one of the things I'm thinking about now, and I know this is coming up a lot in my clients and the teams that they're working with, is how do we get better connected and what are intentional actions we need to take? What are choices that we need to make for ourselves individually? And what are choices that we might want to take for ourselves? Um, as a team, if you're a leader of teams, or if you're somebody who is responsible for a team, even if you're not the core leader, what are things that you need to do? So there's a question similar to that that came in. So we're going to spend a little bit of time answering that today. But I always like to hear from you. How do you want to connect? What are the ways that it's working for you in our very disparate, remote, hybrid, I don't care what word you use. A lot of folks still call it virtual. I always say you're not virtual, you're real. But how are we staying connected in a world that seems to be moving so fast and in a time when we're all over the place? We're not sitting next to each other anymore. How do we stay connected? So, I'd love to always hear from you on that topic. And again, we've got a question that came in earlier that will go a little bit deeper on some thoughts that I have for this person, and maybe for you or someone that you care about who is concerned about staying connected, putting yourself in the rooms. Maybe not necessarily the rooms where it happens, although good stuff happens when you put yourself in the right room, right? But put yourself in connection with people who can make you better, who can inspire you, and who can help you continue to grow and recognize who you are and what superpowers you're bringing to the world. So thanks to my mastermind of folks who I spent some time this weekend with, and I'm sure we'll share some more about that here on LinkedIn sometime soon. But today I've got 4 questions that folks in my insider community and some of you here on LinkedIn who maybe aren't part of my insider community have sent me in advance. And so we'll dive into that. But if you happen to have a question, feel free to pop it into the comments. Or if you want to send me something privately, we'll put it in the queue for next month's Ask Me Anything. Always love to hear from you. And remember, you're not currently part of our insider community. Totally free. That's the place that every week I share ideas, tools, observations, inspiration, stories, things I don't share other places. Comes right in your email. And you can sign up for that at redcaperevolution.com/insiders. So that's INSCIERS if my mental spelling is correct. So uh, you can always message me here on LinkedIn and we can give you the link to sign up directly to. So let's go to questions. You have questions. So here is the first question that came in. I've got more detail here, so I'm going to read it. Dear Darcy, no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to catch up. I lead a team of 20, and 3 of them are managers. So no matter how late I work and how many weekends I work, there's always too much undone. I'm exhausted. Do I just need to quit? Boy, can anybody here relate to that? Can anybody relate to that feeling of, I just can't catch up? One of the things that I've noticed in talking to a lot of the companies that I'm working with and the teams of leaders that we're working on, they're making their plans happen for 2024, is that when we went through the transitions for COVID, for the pandemic, we had something to rally around. We were in what I think of as sprint mode. We knew, okay, here's the next most important thing. And we had that collective energy, that collective focus. But when you are in a sprint, it's a whole lot different than when you're in a marathon. And the mistake that I think a lot of individuals and collective companies and teams are having is that they are trying to maintain that sprint energy, that sprint behavior, even those sprint activities in a marathon world. So, what do I mean by that? So, the things that we may have done or needed to do before may not be the things we need to do now. So, there are a few things, if you are somebody like this person who wrote in, who's feeling like, I can't catch up, I can't catch my breath, I am continuing to feel like the hole is just too deep. I'm not even at ground level, right? I just want the world to stop and freeze. And like, I want a week to just sort everything out and clean stuff up and just feel like I'm back on top of things again. If you're somebody who has never felt like that, please let me know your secrets because I think we've all been there. So, what do? Obviously, we can't put the world on pause, at least not forever. There are some strategies to look to do that. But I think the first thing we have to recognize, especially for this person, as a team of 20, 3 of them are managers, is a topic that was written about recently by my friend Dina Denham Smith in the Harvard Business Review. And it's around how much emotional labor are you putting in? So let's talk about this concept of emotional labor, right? Because it's something that many of us aren't aware of, but many of us are struggling with. So, what is emotional labor? Emotional labor is the intrinsic energy and time that you take, that is the emotion, that is the feeling, that is the around your work. So an example of this would be, I'm going to have a tough conversation coming up with an associate. The emotional labor about thinking through, how am I going to say what needs to be said? How are they going to take it? Where do I want to be prepared for a response? We put so much emotional labor into a lot of our work. And if we're a person who cares about people, then it's needed and it's important. But we often forget that that is work. The emotional labor, the thinking about other people, the planning, the organizing your thoughts so that you have clarity for a conversation, whether it's a tough one or not, that takes time. That takes energy. And for many of us, as we continue to build our skills around managing people, leading teams, growing our leadership to have an impact through people, we're still learning. We're still growing the understanding of how much emotional labor things take. One of the best lessons I got when I was a people manager in the early days of my career was from my friend John, who said, "You know what, Darcy? People take time. People take time." And that's the emotional labor, right? We can't just skim through a tough conversation. We can't skim through thinking about the impact our actions and our decisions will have on other people. So, one of the reasons you can't catch up is because you are also not valuing the emotional labor that you have to do. And maybe you are spending time in emotional labor and then all the other stuff is what feels like it's not it's important, but if you squeeze it into weekends or evenings. The truth is, in your job, especially as a leader and a leader of leaders, the emotional labor is your job. So that leads to the second point. After you recognize that you have emotional labor and it takes time, it takes energy, and it's a big chunk of your job, we have to reevaluate what your real work is. One of the mistakes that I think a lot we've made in a lot of organizations over the past few years is believing that people are like computers and we can just, pop in another chip and add capacity. But humans don't work like computers. We can't run 24/7. We can't just add in more capacity because there's an opportunity, because there's something else that needs to be done. We have to learn, especially today when we have access, 24/7 to all sorts of information and ideas, to be more discerning. And what do I mean by discerning? We have to reevaluate what our job really is. And then we have to really look at what is the problem that our job is designed to solve. Some of you may have heard me say this before, but every job is just a set of problems to be solved. If there were no problems, if there was no pain, there wouldn't be a role there. It wouldn't be a job, right? So I think we've often got lost. And as I talk to my coaching clients, I think we get lost about what's your real job. It's not all the little things. There's a goal, there's an outcome, there's something that your job, your role is intended to serve. And especially when you're a leader of a larger team, that job is to help make those folks better. It is not to do the work. It is to help lead the work, to inspire the work, to help those folks grow. So if you're somebody who's feeling like I can't catch up, I work, and I just never feel like I'm even at ground level. This is a great time to take that big step back. And maybe this is a time to have a conversation with your leaders. Because when we are just piling on ourselves and when things are being just kind of tossed at us, and we're not stopping and being discerning about where are we spending our time? What is the important thing to my company? It's easy to just say, oh, well, that's just a little thing. Oh, I can do that. That's just a little thing. But all the little things add up. Now, this is the exercise that I write about in my book, Red Cape Rescue, called Drop Some Balls, which for a lot of super high achievers, which if you're here watching, that probably describes you, feels very counterintuitive. We've been taught to like catch more balls and never drop a ball. But especially as you grow in levels of leadership, we have to get more discerning about what balls we drop. And some of that may be things that we would love to have the time to do, or things that we feel that somebody else feels are important. We have to have the conversations to recognize what truly is important to our work and where are the places that we make the best and highest value for our organization and also for ourselves. So, if you can't catch up, then really understanding it's time to reevaluate, it's time to recognize how much emotional labor is in your role. And it's also time then to engage others in the solutions. So, this is the step that a lot of people hesitate to do because even with all the conversation in our world around burnout and around overwhelm, I consistently find that smart, hardworking people feel a little bit of shame, a little bit of embarrassment to say, I'm overwhelmed, I have too much. Instead, they say, well, I'll figure it out when, or after we deliver this next project, or after the holidays, or after spring break. But we just defer, defer, defer. So this is the time to be able to engage others because chances are some of the things you're experiencing are things other people might be experiencing too. So starting those conversations with your leaders, with your direct boss, with your peers, and being able to ask for what you need. To say, hey, I notice that these things are going on and they're not a priority, but they take a lot of time. You can propose an experiment. You can do something different. Or one of the things that always makes my clients' eyes go wide is to think about what are the things you're doing because you think it's your should. It's a tape you're playing. But if you stopped it, nobody else would care. That is always a fascinating exercise. I did this for myself several years ago, where I was out of my office for a period of time due to some health issues. And when I came back, I had this like to-do list that was, 2 columns long and on and on. And what I found was that some of the things got done in my absence, some of the things didn't. And it didn't really matter. And I had to really look myself in the mirror and say, why are those on your list? Were they shoulds that only you thought were shoulds? Were they good ideas that just it wasn't the right time or context for those good ideas? I bet you, if you looked at your to do list or the worry list, all the things that left undone, if you're this person, it's like worried you can't catch up. Take a hard look at that list. What's only your should as opposed to things that are important to the best and highest use that you bring to the organization? Okay. Thank you for that question. It's a juicy one, right? We all go through this. So let's go to the next question that was sent in advance. So I've got this here. Here's the detail. My small company is reorganizing to bring a new marketing manager role on board. Now, this new role will take on activities from older, long-standing employees who will not be happy to give the work away to a new, unproven employee. Despite my attempts to share the bigger picture goals of how this will help the organization, the older employees are reluctant and resentful that someone new is taking over important elements of their job, that in quotes. How can I smooth this transition? I really appreciate this question because, as so many of our companies right now are going through reorganization, maybe there are new leaders, maybe there are new issues that they need to solve. people are recognizing there may be places where we don't have the right skill set for not who we've been, but for who we want to be. And this is why sometimes that an organization will bring somebody in from the outside, um, because it's a chance to change direction or to solidify a direction they're going into. Now, sometimes I will admit my observation is that companies aren't always doing the detailed work. By companies, this is people, right? It's us, it's humans. It of recognizing, is this change possible within our existing team? Sometimes we make assumptions, sometimes we make blanket statements. We're human. Those are our biases, right? But in this situation, so the company has decided that they are reorganizing. They're bringing on this new role. Part of that is people doing that work are now going to be asked to do different things or do, let go of things that they've had in the past. So if you're managing this transition, I think one of the core things that you need to recognize for those people who you want to bring um, along, right? That you want to bring on the bus is, what is the identity that they would be giving up with this change? What is the identity that they're giving up or we're asking them to give up with this change? So there's a great book that I recommend often, which is Managing Transitions by Bill Bridges. It's an old book, it's a classic, but it really goes through the model of transition, which actually starts with endings. It starts with endings that first, in order to make a transition, to get to something new, to get what Bridges calls a new beginning, we actually have to have an ending. And an ending may mean more formal closure. An ending may mean recognizing what part of someone's identity might need to shift and change. And just telling people, well, get over it, or, well, this is how it's going to be. You all probably know in your own organizations how that can linger and never get healed, because if people haven't let go of the past, if they haven't been given the space and the grace to grieve sometimes over what they were or how they what was in place, they're never going to move through the transition to be able to accept the new beginning. So for this person, recognizing if you have some long-standing employees, long-time employees, and they are doing certain tasks that you now know need to be done by somebody else, understand first, what is the identity? It's not about the task. I'm going to challenge you to just to remember, it is never about the task. It's about the meaning that they associate with it. So what is our identity? It could be things like status, that by not doing that, I have a loss of status. It could be things like recognition. If I'm not the one who is sitting in the leadership meeting, then, that I get my recognition out of that. This is actually a really good exercise if you're managing any transition with your team, to be able to think about each person and what it is they value. What are the things that are important to them? If you don't know that, that's a good opportunity for some deeper conversations. It's a good opportunity to take a step back and to understand, especially if there are behaviors that you're like, why is that important to them? Like, why is getting the approvals on the annual report so important? Like, somebody else can do that now, but it's their identity. It's the interactions. There is something they are connecting or interpreting to it that doesn't get connected in other ways. So understanding that identity, where their values are, can be helpful first. And then, as you're painting a picture of the new beginning, recognizing either if that identity has to change, just have to face it up front. If you're no longer going to be that person who's in the leadership meetings, Like, then recognizing that's a switch and a transition, and we sometimes people, have to have time to feel bad about that. But bringing them along to ways that especially if there's new work ahead for them, how does that connect to their identity? If there's someone who needs recognition, if there's someone who needs to be able to be seen, how are you as the leader making sure that you are providing that you're consciously thinking about that? We all do things based on our identity, right? I want to be the dependable person, or I want to be the smartest person, or whatever. But we often don't recognize that when something is in conflict with our identity, that's what gets in the way. And so, if you're managing a transition like this, bringing somebody new on board, stop thinking about it just as a role change. Stop saying, well, they just have to get over it. These are human beings we're working with. How do you make sure that you're understanding what that transition actually looks and feels like to them? And how are you creating intentional endings? If it's something that's like, let's, for example, Bridges uses the example of plant closing. Like, instead of trying to skim over it, creating the ceremony, creating the thank you, creating the acknowledgement of what has been in the past, respecting what has been in the past, in order to then close that and be able to free up for the future. So, smoothing the transition starts with recognizing what are the elements of identity that someone is losing by losing these parts of their job. And this could stimulate some great conversations, especially if you have long term employees that you want to make sure that you retain during the transition, and that aren't going to go take their valuable skills elsewhere. So, thank you for the question. If you are here live, feel free, if you have a question, to pop it into the chat. Or if you are watching it later, feel free to put a question in the comments. Or, you can message me anytime and send your question in for next month's Ask Me Anything. So, let's go to the next question that was sent in. And I touched on this a little at the top of our time together. Uh, but it's this issue of connection. Right? It's always fascinating to me that we are connected in more ways than ever, right? Like this, like this. You can text me, you can Slack me, we can reach each other in many ways. But are we actually connecting? We might be connected, but stopping to say, how am I connecting, is important. So the question that this person sent in goes like this: my leadership team is working heads down in each of their areas of expertise. However, there are issues like people management and business growth that affect all of us. I'd like us to connect more on those issues. How can we do this? It's a great question. Again, especially in a time frame when we may not physically be together, or maybe when we're together on a Zoom call, we feel very detached, and all we're doing is we're going through our individual lane. I'm reporting out my lane, and there's nobody that is connecting the dots and facilitating a bigger conversation. So, if you're the leader, and I don't know if this person is a leader or one of the leaders who's just observing this need for connection, if you're the leader, the challenge is you need to create collisions. And what do I mean by collisions? You need to intentionally create spaces, times, containers for people to connect in different ways, creating collisions of people who usually wouldn't connect with each other on topics that are not their core topic. So one of the ways to be able to create these kind of collisions is to do intentional series of leadership meetings where you are, and some people call them retreats, some people call them roundtables, it could be called work sessions, but it's a set aside time, an intentional time that sends the message that says, we know that we have to get outside of our own individual silos and lanes, and we need to be talking, connecting, supporting each other as a whole unit. And the only way that we can really do that is to make sure we are calibrating with each other, we are investing time in it, and we are thinking as the whole, not just as our own part. So I know what you might be thinking. "Ah, there's we've got so many meetings. One more bleep bleep meeting isn't going to fly in my company." Well, let me share this. Increasingly, your leaders, your managers, the people you are working with, they they don't want to be in a meeting because your meeting is boring, because your meeting doesn't move anything forward. Probably half or more of the meetings that you're in, tell me if I'm wrong, are informational. But when we are with human beings, we want to be conversational. Information we can get anywhere. I could send you the information about the updates from product development. I can send that to you in advance. I can post a 2-minute video in the shared Slack channel or the Google Drive or the Dropbox or whatever tool someone might use. But can I actually connect with you as a human and all of the experience and the ideas that you have? And can I invite you to think beyond the ways that you are thinking in your lane? The only way to do that is create collisions and have very specific, facilitated conversations. And I actually think that it's best done in person. I know there's a lot of controversy right now about, do we actually need to be in person that much? And here's my latest thinking on it, just after talking with so many clients who are going through the whole, are people in the office? Are people not in the office? I don't think people have to be in an office all the time. But I think the act and skill of facilitation, of creating connections, creating collisions is the next big leadership skill to build. So what did that mean? That means your job as the leader is not to be the smartest person in the room. Your job is not to tell people what to do. Your job is to create the conversation, to create the container, the time, the frame, the permission that we're going to set aside some time to think differently. Because if we don't set aside time to think differently, if we don't challenge ourselves to say, you know what, yeah, our business is important. The status of product development or the status of recruiting, all of that is super important. But if we're not looking at it as a whole and not invited to have better conversations with each other, we're not going to perform to the level that we can. We're actually going to cut ourselves off from new ideas, from new possibilities that come when you bring 1 plus 1 can equal 5. So creating that container as a leader, being able to facilitate. And if you are not a strong facilitator, this is where hiring somebody, using someone else in your firm, in your company who is a good facilitator. Facilitation doesn't mean let's go around the room and tell each other what we're doing. It means having a structure and a strategy to be able to think differently, a way that is time bound. So it's not the old fashioned whole week retreat where people go away and they come back with a binder that they're never going to look at again. but it is very intentionally created to have people talking, connecting, and making decisions collectively. Now, one of the things that I really like to do with my clients that I find works very well is that we schedule these out over a year. And so as we are starting, and right now we're in the top of the year, as we're getting the teams calibrated around some of the common issues and bigger goals that as a collective group that they have, sure, they all have their own individual goals, but there are collective goals that all of their work needs to connect to. We are starting an arc of a conversation as opposed to it's one meeting and that was a great meeting and then nothing happens from it. So this is also another leadership skill that I think increasingly is important today to practice, to learn, to build that muscle of how do I then help hold people accountable? And how do I do that without being the micromanager? Right? So creating a situation to connect, to create collisions, creates the opportunity for people to generate new ideas and action or to rethink old ideas and action. But once you leave that container, somebody needs to keep the momentum going. And maybe that's the leader. Maybe that's someone who takes turns in from the group. But connection can't just happen once. We have to care about keeping it moving forward. And so what I find is that often like a quarterly step back meeting, a quarterly roundtable, a quarterly mini retreat to address some of these issues and then to remember here's where we were and have little conversations through the time period and then meet again. Here's where we are. What are we learning? What have we done? What can we celebrate? And then to do that again and be able to have that as a repetitive muscle and to build that into this is how we do things as opposed to saying, oh, I think my team just needs a retreat, and so let's just find a couple days at a resort somewhere. I mean, it's lovely, but is it going to have the impact that you want? Connection happens over time. If you're worried that your team is not connecting more, what are the containers, what are the structures that you put in place to create collisions where they can connect better, connect more often, and connect in ways that they probably never expected that they could? Okay, so thank you so much for that question. All right, I think we have one more question before we wrap up today. Oh, this is a doozy, right? So here are the details. I keep feeling second guessed by my leaders. I have a lot to offer and many good ideas, but I don't think they trust me. What do I do now? Oh, trust, right? Who hasn't struggled with trust at some point? We all crave trust. And yet our society is woefully absent of trust and we worry that, we don't trust things. And in many ways for good reason. But the challenge with wanting others to trust you is that it never works to say to them, "Oh, just trust me." It actually the best way to gain trust is to give more trust. I've written about this on my blog, and if you want to read more, I'll put a note in the comments, and I'm happy to send you the direct link to it. But there are some uncomfortable truths about trust. First of all, trust equals truth over time. You can think about that as a little equation, but it's that how do we gain trust? We have to have the truth consistently over time. So we can't just show up in one place and have earned trust. We can't just be one person at one time and be trusted. We have to be delivering our truth over time. This is also a good reminder for leaders who are getting tired of hearing themselves say the same message over and over. They're like, "Well, I already said that last month. What can I say new?" Repetition equals trust, right? The fact that I have heard that before, that it's consistent, that it meets my expectation because it's what you've said before. Repetition is often called the mother of learning. We need to hear things over and over in order to trust them, in order to absorb them, in order to feel like we can make them ours. So, being able to recognize the trust equals truth over time is one way to help make sure that you are gaining trust with your leaders. So, are you consistent about the things you care about? Do you even know? Are you clear on that? And are you communicating, showing up, doing your work in a way that echoes the ways you want to be trusted? One of the other tools that I think is helpful as we think about wanting more trust is to give it more freely. And whenever I'm talking to some of my leaders about this, makes them super uncomfortable. Maybe you're the same, actually, I'm the same way too. I work on this on a regular basis with organizations and, people in my personal life that we interact with. It's easy to stay skeptical. It's easy to stay in fear and worry and kind of close off and on almost the body language I think of is like we're fists up, we're ready for the fight instead of intentionally being counterintuitive, saying, "Am I here with my arms open? Am I actually assuming positive intent?" I talk about this in a chapter in my book around being able to start with assuming positive intent, to trust that, you know, they probably are doing what they're doing for a good reason in their minds. It's probably not intending to make me feel bad or to make me look bad. The idea of assuming positive intent, I tell a story in my book around a gentleman that I worked with who got an email from a colleague and immediately it hit all his hot buttons. The email was basically asking for something that, my client had already delivered. And as we talked about it, he had created all these stories in his head of, oh, he doesn't think I've done it well. He's just trying to show off. He doesn't think I'm good at my job. And ultimately, it turned out to be a misunderstanding, a missed piece of data. The email did not mean anything. But my client had gone into this whole emotional flare, right? Because he didn't start off in a place of trust, in a place of assuming positive intent. When he got there and actually asked a calm follow-up question, and y'all know how on email it can be so easy to like rip back your, that's already done. What are you talking about? Right? It's like assume positive intent and chill. When he actually picked up the phone and had a conversation, it wasn't any of the stories that he'd made up in his head. It wasn't really anything about him at all. And he spent so much time in the emotional swirl of it. Maybe you've done the same thing. Something hit your hot button. It all goes back down to trust. And if we want more trust, we have to show it to others first. Sounds wild, sounds counterintuitive, but it's super important. Now, in this situation where they're feeling second guessed by leaders, this is where having an intentional conversation and being able to ask for what you need is so important. So, for example, if this person is feeling second guessed because a leader is redoing work, or is as the person, let's say the person's made a decision, and the leader is going back and saying, "Have you really thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that?" And the person's like, "Yeah, of course I've thought about that. I know my job." You can take that person. You can ask that person, and it's not, "Hey, why don't you trust me?" But the conversation, and all good conversations when we're gaining and getting feedback, I think go to what's the observable behavior? The observable behavior is something that I like to say, if you were being followed around in your life by a documentary film crew, what would they see? Right? The observable behavior isn't the whole story in your head. It's when this happened, this also happened. And it could be, when this happened, my interpretation was this. But the observable behavior is the starting point, right? And this is a way that you can start a conversation with somebody about something that you're trying not to get in the swirl about, that you're trying not to read too much into, but you need to know the data, right? You need to know the answer. So if the observable behavior is, I've noticed when I send out the weekly summary, you tend to ask me 4 or 5 of the same questions that I've already thought of. Is there something else behind those questions? Are you concerned I am not thinking about them? And being able to just put it on the table, not with criticism, not with judgment, but just, it's an observable behavior. You are looking to seek out information for you. Because a lot of times, and let's face it, folks, you've done this too, right? We do things in our busy day to day lives without thinking. And often, if you are worried that someone doesn't trust you, sometimes we have to call the question. I'm observing this. It's making me concerned about this. Is there something else happening here? Or I'm observing when you do this, I'm perceiving that you don't trust me to handle that. If that's accurate, I'd like to talk more about it, because I would like to have your trust that I can handle it. Sometimes we just need to put it on the table. So, what is that for you? Where is the place where you want more trust, that you might have to turn it around and intentionally give more trust? And what's the tough conversation? Maybe it's not even tough. Maybe it's just making the time and the space for an intentional conversation to ask the question. This is what I've observed. This has been my reaction or interpretation or my thoughts about it. Is that accurate? Am I hearing you correctly? Is there something else that that I should know? Is there something else that you would like to see for me? When we trust somebody to have a bigger conversation, it also opens them up to reciprocating, to when we start to identify, hey, I'm not sure that we're in a place of trust here. Not those words, people will roll their eyes at you. But if you're following the model that I just laid out, then someone stops and they can calibrate for themselves. And you know what? If they don't quite trust you, people are adults. They'll find a way to say it or show it. Now, I know some people argue and say, oh, yeah, no one's going to admit it. But here's what you'll hear. You'll hear, well, there have been a few times when this happened and I was worried about that. Okay, great. If they are still worried about something, that could be a trust issue. Then you have a problem to solve, right? Then you have something specific to be able to come up with an action. It's like, oh, well, I didn't know you thought that way, or I didn't realize that was that important to you. Can we talk about some way to make that easier? to make that better, this ultimately puts you back in control. And if you've been with me for a while, you know that I always talk about there are three things that we control: what we say, what we do, and what we think. And often, one of the things that's happening is that we are getting so caught up in our story, in our brain, in the swirl of this this must be true. Doesn't have to be true. We need to ask. We need to raise the conversation. We need to take control. And yeah, you might find data that said, you know what, actually, we we don't fully trust you all the way on this project. And so that's why I'm asking these questions or checking up. Great. That gives you something focused and specific that you can then act on. Because without having things that are focused and specific, you can stay in the swirl, drive yourself wild, and ultimately feel really bad about the things that you're doing when you might not need to feel bad. I would always rather know what I could be doing better than not knowing at all that something wasn't a good experience. So, as you think about getting more trust, it actually ties back to where we started today, too, right? We talking about the emotions of being connected, the emotional labor of what it takes to work in a world where humans matter. All work is personal. I know that many of us have been taught that work is not personal, but I don't care. Even if you're a programmer, if you are working with technology, people make things happen. People are the part that we have to figure out how we work with them. And I think the person that we often have to do the most thinking about is the person that we are. What do we want? Who are we? How do we approach things? And how do we make sure that we're taking the initiative to take back control, what we do, what we say, and most importantly, what we think? All right. Well, we are coming up on the top of the hour. I Those are the questions that I had for this month. We'll be back here next month. In the interim, if you're not part of our insider community where I send stories, tools, inspiration, ideas, maybe a few laughs here and there every week, please come over to redcaperevolution.com/insider and join us there. It's free, it's fast, it's easy, and even a little bit fun. So, and we will see you back here at next month. We are coming up on March. So March 4th, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thank you so much for being part of my community, connecting with me here. And in the meantime, keep wearing that red cape, keep soaring. Bye for now.